Shoreline. Okay, sorry. Okay. Podcast. Okay. Tonight on the PowerScripting podcast, we are pleased to have with us David Wilson from Microsoft. Hello, David. How's it going?
Hey, how's it going, guys?
Doing good. Man, it's been a long time. We have been slack at our jobs. This is we kind of fell down on the job, and we get paid a lot for this job. Mm-hmm. We're slacking, but no, we're back. And David, I'm very glad to have you going. We almost had you on what September or something like that, November?
Yeah, sometime back at the MVP Summit.
Yep, right. Well, I'm glad we waited because now you have like a couple pieces of news that are relevant.
That's true. I think it's much better now because there's some perspective after all the things have happened, and now we can actually get into the meat of a lot of this stuff. So I think it's good. I'm definitely excited to be here to talk to you guys about it.
Awesome. So before we get into it, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What do you do?
Not a whole lot. I mean, I'm pretty lazy. But no, I started at Microsoft in about 2008 after I got out of college, and I worked in the virtual machine manager team, System Center Virtual Machine Manager. Some people with a podcast probably are familiar with that product, but I worked on that product for, I don't know, about 7 years, and then eventually moved on to working on the PowerShell ISE and the other PowerShell development tools. So I'm pretty excited about development tools in general. So whenever I heard that there was an opening to work on the ISE, I just jumped on it right away, and here I am now.
Awesome. So what kind of things did you work on for the VMM team?
I was working on the user interface for the most part, and ironically enough, I was working on some of the interaction that we did with PowerShell because VMM was one of the first products in Microsoft that actually exposed a PowerShell layer as the kind of primary way to interact with its logic, its functionality. So in the UI, we had this thing called the view script button. So if you went to any wizard in the UI that actually does something, you could kind of go through the wizard, configure all your stuff, and then click view script, and then it will show you the actual PowerShell script of what you had configured in the UI. So it's kind of a helpful tool for people who wanted to sort of use the UI to learn the product and then eventually figure out how to automate the usage of the product. And I actually worked on some of the tools that enabled that script generation for the UI so that it was really easy for the UI developers to make these scripts. And eventually I also worked on doing a UI extensibility model. And it's a little bit weird because we called our extensibility model add-ins and ISE calls it add-ons. So I have to catch myself a lot of times when I'm talking about it to make sure I don't say the wrong thing. But yeah, basically stuff like that. Mostly, UI infrastructure and that sort of thing.
Okay, awesome. So during that time, I mean, you were on that team for quite a while there. What was there a difference in how you and your team used PowerShell, kind of internally over that 7 years or so?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Even though PowerShell was sort of a big part of the product, the way that we sort of exposed it and used it was, I wouldn't call it necessarily the right way, but it was powerful enough for people who knew PowerShell to use the full sort of power of PowerShell. But I didn't really personally learn a lot about PowerShell scripting until I actually moved and started working on the ISE and PowerShell development tools. So really, it was just like making the things work and not really learning so much about PowerShell scripting. Yeah, it was kind of interesting.
So when did you join the PowerShell team?
Well, it was sort of a strange path, but last year, I think it was around this time last year, actually, I interviewed with another group inside of the Windows Server organization who currently was owning the development of the ISE. And they were tasked with the ownership of the ISE because they also own some other WPF-based UI. So it sort of made sense for them to sort of own this piece of UI, even though it wasn't under the PowerShell team per se. But just through the process of working on the ISE there, and then some of the other opportunities that opened up about VS Code, et cetera, I eventually found my way to the actual PowerShell team. I think it was maybe August of last year. So I became an actual member of the PowerShell team at that point.
Awesome. Welcome aboard. So was there a gap? It seems like there might have been a gap, or at least I suspect there might have been a gap, where nobody was really doing anything with ISE. That was just my impression.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah. So I think that there was minimal maintenance of the ISC for a while. I think in the early days of the ISC, there were a couple of developers who were like really instrumental in getting it off the ground and doing a lot of really great development on the ISC. And I think that these people moved on, and then ISC development changed hands a few times, and there was definitely some sort of minor improvements happening here and there. The biggest thing more recently, obviously, was the remote session support, which Paul Higginbotham helped add. And I think there's a couple other things. But yeah, for the most part, the development was pretty slow on the ISC for a long time. And that's whenever I saw the opportunity to come and help sort of kickstart the development again once I noticed that there was nobody. I'd heard there was a position open for actually maintaining the ISC. So it was a weird thing. It was sort of like people... I don't know, when people look at a UI-based development tool, I think most people look at it and say, I don't really want to work on that. They would rather work on like the engine, the PowerShell engine, or some other part of the system. But for me, I really like development tools. I'm a fanatic about code editors, so it made a lot of sense for me to come and jump in on this project and try to help improve it, because there's just so many areas where it could be improved that it sort of spoke to me a little bit, I guess.
Sure. All right, great. That makes sense. So, now, how big is the team? I mean, are you kind of it in terms of the development effort for ISC right now?
Yeah, I am the sole developer of the ISC, and
funny.
Yeah, that's it's fine that way, because really, I think that over the last year there was a lot of discussion about sort of what we were going to do with the ISC, because Windows Server as a whole is sort of moving away from user interface, but still, the ISC is a really useful tool, and a lot of people depend on it. There's a lot of fans of the ISC, so we're trying to figure out sort of how do we kind of continue bringing the ISC forward in this new world where we're sort of going more towards remote management and automation through PowerShell. So, I think around the middle of last year is when I started looking into bringing the ISC out of Windows and being able to ship it independently. And I had actually done a prototype of that probably around July or August of last year and showed it to some people in the PowerShell team. And they were really excited about it, but still we were trying to figure out, what our priorities were. So, through talking to some MVPs like Tobias Weltner and just sort of talking amongst ourselves in the team, we decided that the best thing to do was to sort of not make drastic changes to the ISC that would, sort of break the world, but to sort of gradually evolve it into something better that still, has the general shape of things as they are now.
Okay. So I'm going to sort of change topics and probably come back into ISC a little bit here, but I'm going to point out that at the same time, or perhaps not the same time, but another product that you're working on is Visual Studio Code. And that introduces some questions about, how much time and do you spend on one project versus the other, and what priorities, and why are there two different aspects of, developer tool, if you will, for PowerShell? Why not focus on one or the other? So I guess kind of bring us through how this project started.
Sure. It's a great question, actually. So the way that this started was, I think it was pretty soon after I joined the initial effort of ISE, earlier last year, that the VS Code team was starting to approach other teams in the company about actually bringing in new language support, because this was before they had ever announced that they, or actually it was before they even announced VS Code. So I think they announced VS Code in March of last year. And they didn't have an extensibility model for a long time after that. It wasn't advertised. They actually did have one, but it was sort of early in development. But some people came to talk to the PowerShell team and said, hey, there's this new editor that's web-based and sort of like a new paradigm, and they want to try to see if PowerShell would fit into that. So I sort of jumped on the opportunity to sort of start figuring out how to make that work. And sort of around the same time, a summer intern joined the PowerShell team, and one of the leads in the PowerShell team had tasked her with looking into adding PowerShell support to Visual Studio Code. So those things sort of came together, and I worked with this intern, Kayla Davis, to get sort of the initial work off the ground, which at first required making a C# based language service for PowerShell that basically wraps the PowerShell APIs and is able to communicate with VS Code through, at the time, was the TypeScript language server protocol, which is a protocol that uses messages encoded in JSON format, which they send back and forth between the editor. So we basically started this effort where we started writing this C# language service for PowerShell, and then we took the existing TypeScript extension code and sort of morphed it into a PowerShell extension. So the very first versions of the PowerShell extension were just like a modified TypeScript extension. So the sort of process over the next few months was that, I worked with this intern to add more features, and then the VS Code team at the same time, they were like really rapidly evolving the extensibility model because they were trying to figure out what their final model would be before they brought it to the world. And over time, it simplified a lot. It actually got a lot easier. Like right now, if you look at the VS Code PowerShell repo on GitHub, you'll see that there's probably about 5 source files. In the beginning, there were like 20. So they really simplified the model down and made it a lot easier to add a new language to VS Code. And I think around, August or September, it was around the time where we actually started, nailing things down and getting prepared to ship with the announcements that happened, I think, in early November. So around this whole time, I guess it was also the time where we went to the MVP summit, and I gave the presentation to the MVPs about what we had been working on. And by that point, things had solidified enough to where I started bringing in some of the PowerShell MVPs to kind of help a little bit to sort of see how they may be able to contribute to these efforts.
So when would you recommend, looking at the 2 tools, as well as anything else that folks might use, when do you see people using the ISE versus using Visual Studio Code?
To me, it really comes down to what your normal day-to-day tasks are. If you are the kind of person who is mostly writing PowerShell and loves writing PowerShell, that your job is basically automating things, then the ISE is definitely the place to be. It already does everything that you need to do in PowerShell. It's the best PowerShell experience that we produce. Now, Visual Studio Code does a lot more than just PowerShell. So that is a great experience for someone who may do primarily like C# development. But even though I guess VS Code is not like perfect for C# development at this point, it's getting better, but not totally there yet. Or if you do web development, because it has really great support for JavaScript and TypeScript and HTML, CSS, all the other tools, basically. So if you are more of a developer-focused person, I guess if your job is more developer-focused, then it makes a lot more sense to use Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio. So really the point behind, spending time on both of these editing experiences is so that we are giving people the right amount of choice, the right tools for the right sort of task. It's really the most important thing is to be able to reach out to developers who maybe don't use PowerShell that much because, PowerShell is not a part of the tools that they use. Adam Driscoll really helped out a lot with that whenever he made Posh tools for Visual Studio. That actually opened the door to a lot of developers being able to do, pretty rich PowerShell editing in Visual Studio, which was a missing. I think that was like sorely needed for a long time. But really the work for VS Code is really more than that, because the core of this whole thing is this sort of platform or library, if you would call it that, called PowerShell Editor Services. And really, VS Code is just like a thin layer over the top of this whole engine of PowerShell Editor Services. And this thing basically allows us to provide the same level of PowerShell editing experience in any other editor as well. So Sublime Text, Atom, what else is out there? I don't know. Pretty much any modern editor that has some kind of extensibility model, you can plug this thing in with some amount of work and have a rich PowerShell experience there. So really, we're just trying to expand the options that people have for where they are able to develop PowerShell.
Okay, great. So how is this different? And for example, you mentioned Adam Driscoll's work in Visual Studio. Why it seems to me that the integration with editors and kind of in general has gone an interesting path. This editor services that you're talking about, it's basically a web service that's running kind of in process, right? And you're talking back and forth with it between the editor and the service to do things.
Yep.
You look up some syntax or help or definitions or whatever. You, and you mentioned before saying the Visual Studio code is it's kind of web based. This is kind of a new paradigm in programming, and Atom is the same way, I understand. Do you have any kind of general comments on that kind of progression? I mean, it's kind of turning developers of desktop applications into web developers.
Honestly, I've been following the progression of sort of web desktop apps for probably the last 3 or 4 years, and I've done quite a lot of development with Node.js and with Cordova for doing mobile apps. And I have to say that I have been the most productive and enjoyed my coding the most when using sort of the JavaScript-based platform to write applications. And now that really means writing applications that probably are talking to some web service or something like that is written in some other language. And I guess that's a little heretical for me to say because I work at Microsoft, but the reality is that the JavaScript ecosystem has sort of exploded in the last few years, and it's turned into this place where there's a lot of innovation because you have a lot of languages that compile from something into JavaScript. So there's TypeScript, which is a great language, which is basically a superset of JavaScript, which gives you typing, which makes it a lot more comfortable for C# developers. And I personally feel that it's a great experience. And then you have things like CoffeeScript, which is okay. And there's a language called PureScript, which is like a Haskell variant. So if you want to do functional programming, you can do that, and it compiles to JavaScript. There's also a language called Elm, which is another functional programming language that compiles to JavaScript. So there's this sort of weird world now where people are starting to target the JavaScript runtimes like V8 or Chakra Core instead of trying to target like the .NET framework for application development, because you have the benefits of HTML, CSS, sort of these tried and true tools that people have been using forever. And it just sort of makes the development process easier. And the other great thing is it's really easy to sort of like reload a page. You don't have to recompile a whole application whenever you're developing a web-based app. You sort of like just change some stuff. Maybe it recompiles one small file somewhere, and then you just reload the page and it's all there. So it's interesting to see these web-based applications sort of proliferate, like Visual Studio Code, the Atom editor, a lot of other tools that are coming out. They look like native applications, but they're actually based on HTML and JavaScript. So I feel like we're going to continue to see more of that. But there's also the problem that these things aren't super performant on mobile devices. Like if you have an app that's written in HTML and JavaScript, sometimes those things can be a little flaky on mobile apps or mobile platforms. But there's also some interesting things going on in the world of like the React UI model in JavaScript, where they actually have the ability to run JavaScript code that has like React components, but they show you native UI on a mobile app. So there's all this really interesting innovation happening in that space. So I think more people are starting to go in that direction. I think maybe that was way too much description, but
yeah, that's cool. That's cool. I appreciate that perspective. Let's get back to ISE, and wanted to bring up ISE preview. So I'll just kind of set you up. Tell us what the ISE preview is.
So the ISE preview is a new model for shipping improvements to the ISE on a faster cadence, sort of like how we do with the VS Code extension for PowerShell, so that we can start to evolve the ISE to become more of a modern experience while not really having to deal with the problems of trying to ship it as part of Windows. So we want to be able to add new cool things to the ISE and see what people think, get feedback on it, and be able to iterate more quickly before we take those improvements and put them back into the built-in ISE that comes with Windows. So the first release that we did a couple weeks ago was basically just to get it out there and to see if people can install this and see whether it works for them, whether they have any sort of major blocking issues. And to sort of see what people think about the model, because at first I was thinking we're trying to ship this via the PowerShell gallery, and people might say, why are you shipping it via the gallery? But to me it sort of makes sense because it's a pretty core part of the PowerShell ecosystem, and it's pretty convenient to get it that way. So we're sort of
I thought
starting.
That was an odd. an odd sort of minor shoehorn. I mean, it works. I get it. You're right. It's related. It just feels a little funny. That's all. So
Yeah, it does
tell
feel-
us how that works. Behind the scenes in sense of, I mean, I've not actually done it yet. I have to admit. So how are you packaging and delivering an application through PowerShell Gallery?
It's pretty easy, actually. So I've taken the code for PowerShell ISE out of the Windows code base. I figured out how to build it independently of the Windows code base, which took a little bit of time. But I'm building the C# binaries for the ISE, and I'm basically wrapping them up in a PowerShell module, which is really just, aside from the PSD file, it's just a PSM1 file that just has a couple of commandlets that are just for sort of bootstrapping the process of using the ISE. But the ISE is running directly from your local module path or the current local machine module path based on where you've installed it to. So there's a couple commandlets. One of them is start-ISE preview, and it just finds the installation path that the module's in, and then just launches the exe from there. So it's really straightforward. It's not really anything that special.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
So one thing I would like to talk about for sure, now that you mentioned the fact that you did present this to us at the MVP Summit, so I guess I can talk about it and not get in trouble.
Oh, yeah.
One of the things that when you showed us Visual Studio Code and showed us the PowerShell support in it, I was shocked at how fast IntelliSense worked compared to the performance I'm used to in the ISE. Right. Now, I haven't had as many problems as I used to with the ISE in performance. I'm not sure why, but you're in the ISE and you'll try and do tab completion and IntelliSense times out, or sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Is one of the things you're going to work on in the preview getting around those types of issues?
Yeah, I haven't really figured out where that's coming from yet. There is a lot of sort of wiring in the ISE that kind of has a few layers of abstraction, mainly because we're using a modified version of the Visual Studio Editor control in the ISE. Okay. And there's like a lot of stuff that you have to do to sort of wire up IntelliSense and syntax highlighting and stuff with that code. So there may be something that's causing the slowness just from the sort of the layering perspective, but it could just be the way that the ISE is written. The host implementation in the ISE is, sadly to say, not the best code in the world. And that's not to really criticize anyone who may have written the code in the past, but it's really difficult to sort of trace through everything that's going on. So I imagine there's just some general performance problems in the code itself.
Okay.
So in the ISE preview, one of the things that I'm about to start working on now is I'm going to start bringing in PowerShell editor services as the core of the ISE, so that we have the same core implementation of all the same editing logic that will be shared across the ISE, VS Code, any other editors that use PowerShell editor services, as well as potentially Visual Studio, because I've been talking to Adam Driscoll about using PowerShell editor services in Posh Tools as well.
So, nice.
So we'll have the same core across all these different editors, and whatever performance characteristics you have in one editor, you should theoretically have similar performance characteristics in other editors, just sort of depending on how that rolls out. But
okay.
This is sort of an interesting new world in the sense that we have the ability to do some really interesting things now. So if we have the shared host, we can do things like having a new extensibility model where you write new commands for an editor in PowerShell, and they show up in all the different editors. So one of the cool things I want to work on really soon is adding a command palette in the ISE that's sort of like what you see in Visual Studio Code, where you hit, like in VS Code, you hit Control-Shift-P, and it pops this window down where you can sort of type in the name of a command.
Right.
And it basically shows you all the available commands in VS Code. I want to do something similar in the ISE, where a PowerShell module could expose an editor command with a really simple registration commandlet, and it will show up in this list of commands. And it will show up there for the ISE, would potentially show there for VS Code, maybe Visual Studio in some way, however that works. And also Sublime Text has a similar system. Atom has a similar system. So all these editors could benefit from this shared core that allows them to extend the editor using PowerShell script.
Yeah, it's a pretty compelling thing to be able to have that level of impact to multiple tools like that. What are there any kind of goals that you had in mind? Specifically of areas you wanted to hit first. Once you got the ISE preview out, and then the ability to kind of iterate on your own.
Yeah, well, this is one of the main things is basically being able to rip out all of the old logic in the ISE and replace it. However, that's not something, I'm making it sound a lot more dramatic than it really will be. It's going to be a slow evolution over time where at first we'll bring in editor services as a new experimental PowerShell tab. So you can run the normal PowerShell tab and this experimental PowerShell tab at the same time. And the new one will be using editor services. And we'll use that to sort of validate the integration for maybe a few months just to make sure that things are going smoothly. And at the time where we feel like the support level of functionality in editor services is good enough to replace the existing PowerShell tab, we're going to switch them so that we'll have a legacy PowerShell tab that has all the old code and then the new current sort of PowerShell tab. So this will form the basis of sort of a lot of things in the ISE going forward, because the other big area of investment in the ISE will be extending the add-on model. So one way of extending the add-on model is to provide this common extensibility framework for editor services. But the other way is to take the existing add-on model and make it capable of doing more things. So make it easier to add maybe toolbar icons or add menu items anywhere you'd like to add them, or context menu items, or maybe inject UI in more places in the shell. There's a lot of things we could do that would actually make it so that the ISE could be a lot more rich by enabling people to do a lot more things with their add-on code. So since the ISE is a pretty good shell, it's a pretty good graphical shell already, I want to let that be its role. Let it be the graphical shell, let it have those sort of core editing capabilities. But then any new functionality we want to build into the ISE, I would like to do it via the add-on model rather than putting it, like in the direct code base. This allows me to sort of serve my own needs and make new functionality that's rich, but also give the other add-on developers, the ability to make also these rich integrations with the new API changes. So that's. Mm-hmm.
Looking at, I'm just thinking a little bit about how Sublime Text works, and you can do some things that are interesting. I don't know if it hosts, if it ships with a version of Python or how they do it exactly, but I know that you can execute Python in it, and that affects the runtime of the editor. And you can, for example, install plugins, and I think that some of the plugins use Python. So I guess what I'm pointing out here is that there's probably going to be a point at which you're able to kind of bootstrap a plugin system in the ISE that others could then build extensions on and kind of have a library of them, and maybe it would use the PowerShell gallery or somewhere else, and all these things can just kind of tie together.
Yep, and one important thing for that, which I also want to work on soon once I find the time, is to provide a sort of an add-on UI in the ISE, which is like an automatic updater. So, a lot of these different editors, they have a window you can pull up that will show you the latest updates for all of the extensions that are installed. And also they will sort of give you an indication saying, hey, there's new updates. So I'd like to give the ISE a similar experience where you have this centralized place to manage the extensions you have in your UI and get updated about get notified about new updates. Because right now, the PowerShell gallery is awesome. It's great to have this sort of library of PowerShell modules that's so easy to pull things from and to publish modules with it. The thing that we're sort of missing at the moment is sort of some way to be automatically notified that one of the modules has been updated. So it's really important to get this sort of feature built into the ISE or through an add-on so that we can start to evolve this ecosystem of extensions for the ISE. Because right now there's a lot of really cool extensions to the ISE, but I think that they're just not being surfaced well enough for people to know what their options are and to be able to sort of manage the extensions they use. So it's definitely an area of improvement.
So would you be able to use the same method to be able to tell, like, if a module that you installed from the gallery had been updated and track all that stuff too?
I think Tobias Weltner asked me about that. He's like, okay, well, it's great if you could update the ISE-based modules, but what about the other modules that you have installed? And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't show updates for just whatever PowerShell modules that you have installed from the gallery. So there's this get installed modules commandlet that gives you a list of all the modules that you have, and it should be pretty easy for me to just sort of check and see which ones have been updated and be able to tell the user, hey, here's some modules with updates. Click update to update them all, and you're good to go.
That's a good plan.
Yeah,
love to see.
I think it's
absolutely.
Yeah, it's it'll be a lot of work, but one of the things that's really awesome about what's happening in the PowerShell team right now is that there's a real push for getting things to be open source and to get sort of community feedback and collaboration. And what I'd really like to do for some of these new ideas for features in the ISE, since we can't actually open source the ISE just yet, is to make it so that these new Microsoft written features for the ISE are done as open source add-ons so that the community can come and help sort of fill in the gaps here and there wherever they sort of see something missing. Because since I'm the sole developer on the ISE right now, I can't do everything at once. So I think this will be an interesting way of getting people involved. One thing I've sort of noticed with PowerShell editor services and the VS Code extension is that there haven't been a lot of contributions because it's sort of out of people's comfort zone to write TypeScript or to write C#. But if we can sort of get some add-ons going with PowerShell, then there may be more contributions from the community and people will feel more comfortable getting involved with those things. So we'll see where that goes. But I'm hoping that we can sort of all get together and make these new features rather than it just be something that Microsoft ships, whenever we have time to do it.
Yeah. So speaking of shipping, how often do you plan on shipping ISE preview releases?
I'm going to try to ship a release of the ISE preview, or let's say a major release that has new features once a month. I'm also going to try to ship a new release of VS Code extension with new features once a month. And this sounds insane because it's a lot of work, but the reality is once we get the ISE and VS Code converged on PowerShell editor services, then most of the work is shared. And that means that people like Keith Hill, who's my new co-maintainer on PowerShell editor services and the VS Code plugin, he can help with some of the sort of new things that we want to some of the new things that we want to do for PowerShell editor services that will show up in both VS Code and the ISE. So I feel like it's going to be difficult at first, but I think that we'll get into a rhythm eventually where we can start delivering more value on this monthly cadence. It will require that we don't try to bite off more than we can chew for a given month. We'll have to sort of scale it back and do smaller releases with new improvements. But I think maybe that's a better way to do it so that we don't spend too much time working on new features that we haven't validated with customers, with users yet, and sort of go too far with that. So I want to see if I can ship even faster. Maybe even bi-weekly or something. If we can get some small feature improvements that are sort of independent enough that we can ship a little bit faster, we may even go faster. I don't know. I mean, I want to experiment a little bit because we're still trying to figure out this model of shipping out of box and having more control over our ship cycle. So there'll be some experimentation, but my goal in general is to ship both of these things once a month.
Awesome. So how long does it take to actually cut a build and then get that script updated and then get everything pushed to the PowerShell gallery and so forth? What's that part of the process?
So for the VS Code extension, it's a little bit more complicated because there's a few different pieces in play. So the release process for the VS Code extension is that we finish up our efforts on PowerShell editor services, and we have to do a build of PowerShell editor services for release, and then I have to take the binaries from that build and I have to get them signed with the Microsoft the digital signature keys, whatever. And that's actually not that hard. That's not that hard. We actually have a system in place where I basically take the files, I go to this website, and I upload the files to the website, and then assign a couple of people to approve it. And then, as fast as they get back to me in approving the signing process, I get the signed DLLs back. Then I can continue my work. So I've got a few scripts that actually automate the sort of packaging process. So once I get the signed binaries, the script will take those binaries and then put them back into NuGet packages and then upload them to NuGet. So since PowerShell Editor Services is meant to be used as both a .NET library and as a hosted process, I ship them to NuGet so that developers can use those projects.
Right.
But then I use those sort of packages and binaries as the basis for the VS Code PowerShell release. So that one is actually a little bit simpler because the VS Code team's done a pretty good job of making tools that make it easy to publish and update. So I just basically take the binaries that we've got signed, move them over to the bin folder of the VS Code PowerShell project, and then just run a publish command that they've provided. So, whenever we're ready to ship, if we don't have any last minute bugs to worry about, I can get the shipping done in about an hour. I mean, maybe less. It really just depends on the signing part is the only thing I don't have control over as far as time is concerned.
That's cool.
So
that's pretty
great.
amazing, really.
Yeah. So, whenever we ship something and there's a major issue that people are saying, oh, this is crashing for me for whatever reason, then I can literally go and fix the bug and then do a turnaround release, like a 0.1 release or whatever, the next day or even the same day if I had to. So I have a lot of freedom as far as when I ship, and I really like that. I think that's one of the best things about my job right now is that I have total control of when I ship. I don't have to ask permission. I don't have to go and tell people I'm about to ship. I just do it. And this gives me a lot of freedom to be able to make people happy. And that makes me happy because, my whole job is to make people more productive. So,
all right. So you work at Microsoft,
Yep.
one of the most prominent, largest software companies in the world. And did you ever imagine that you would be shipping a product by yourself, basically?
No, but it's something that I always wanted to do, and I didn't think it would happen. And because of my many years of working in Virtual Machine Manager, the world we lived in was you're basically shipping once per year, or if you're lucky, once every 6 months. And to me, that was just the most excruciating process possible, only because I felt like, I make something and I can't show it to someone and get them to use it and get feedback and then go and, make it better. I feel like there's this protracted process, and I don't really have the ability to talk to the customers directly and sort of get involved in getting people to use the product or the features. So when this opportunity came along to start working on these projects, especially the fact of them being open source, I just jumped on it. That's why I'm so gung ho about all this stuff. Is that this is exactly what I've always wanted to be doing, and I have the perfect platform for it right now. So to be able to ship updates whenever I want is the best thing in the world. So I'm hoping that nobody starts to pay too much attention to what I'm doing so that I'll continue to get to do this stuff. But I think that the problem is that people are starting to pay attention a little bit because, people are getting excited about these things. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. The sense that I get from management and the PowerShell team is that people are really, they want this to be the model. They want to be able to ship updates to things whenever we need to, and to be able to have more direct sort of relationship with the customer to be able to build the right things and to make sure that people are happy with what we're doing. So I don't think anything's going to change. I think that I think this is just a start of more things like this happening in the PowerShell team.
Well, I think you landed on a good, or maybe the perfect kind of project for this kind of model, right? I mean, you're not SQL Server,
Yes, actually, I think that it's almost too good because this is not these tools are not mission critical. I mean, if there's a problem with them, it's not like it's going to lose you money in your business, and nobody's going to really try to murder me if I cause a problem for them or something like that. So I feel pretty comfortable in iterating and trying new things. Now, for the PowerShell engine itself, that would be more difficult because if people are taking a dependency on you and their whole business model is wrapped around using your software, then that could be risky. But the reality is that we're moving into a world where people understand this sort of more rapid ship cycle, and they know when not to use like the latest bits for their production machines. So you have this sort of duality of having sort of like, really nice stable bits that are shipping, as well as this like really fast loop of iteration on new features, where the customer can say, hey, maybe this is not the right way to do this. Let's change this. And then, 6 months later, you get like a stable build where, you can really take a dependency on it. So, Microsoft in general is still learning how to do this well, but the PowerShell team is they really wanted to make this happen, I think, as far as it being the right thing to do.
So one more question, or one or two more questions here, and then I think we're going to wrap up. So now, are you connected at all, aware at all of what's going on with Nano Server and how there's going to be some GUI-based admin tool, a web-based admin tool for Nano? The reason I ask is that it seems there might be some interesting places for you to plug your editor services in.
That's a great question. I don't know much about sort of like the plans for Nano Server, but people have been bringing up the idea to me repeatedly over the last 6 months or so that it makes a lot of sense to, if we have this web-based remote management tool set, to have a PowerShell editing experience there that would actually be able to do remote PowerShell editing. I think there may be some work already started in that area that is being done by another team, but my hope is to sort of be able to work with them to use some of the stuff that we're already doing so that we can continue to have this consistent PowerShell development experience across all the places that it appears. One other place that we're sort of interested in trying to integrate with is Azure Automation, because Azure Automation, it's a big one for PowerShell. There's a lot of PowerShell integration there, and it would make sense if you were able to have more rich editing of Azure Automation scripts on their web interface. They've done a really good job of making their PowerShell ISE add-on, and that's great for people who want to be in the ISE, but there's probably also people who prefer the web experience, and you would want to be able to quickly edit scripts there and have a nice experience with IntelliSense and code navigation and all that stuff. So, that's sort of like a longer term thing, trying to figure out more places where we can plug this stuff into, but it's definitely something that people have sort of in the midterm in their mind.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Anything else from you, Jonathan?
I don't think so. I'm just really excited about the potential of getting some performance improvements, because I live in the ISE. That's where I spend most of my time during the day. So any improvements to the ISE, I'm all about that.
Cool. So like for both of you guys, what would be like the amazing feature that if added would just like change your life to like the ISE?
The biggest thing for me would be improvements to the performance of tab completion and the improvements to IntelliSense. Mm-hmm. Because those things allow me to get code out of my head into a script faster. And that's the most important thing to me right now, is just being able to not be held back by the speed of the tool I'm using.
Yeah, that can be excruciating.
Yeah, I would... I feel strongly about those as well, but I'll say probably the have an extensibility model with the ability to browse and check for updates, and write the extensions in PowerShell script, and as opposed to XAML or what have you, things like that. I mean, it'd be neat to just using the knowledge that I have about PowerShell and maybe manipulating a buffer and I don't know, encrypting a string of text. I'm just randomly pulling something out of my head here. I can conceive of how to do that in PowerShell. I could write an extension to do that without having to get into the GUI part so much. It would be a very narrowly scoped kind of extension. That would be cool. I could contribute in that way.
Exactly. I think that's the important thing for this new extensibility model, is that you shouldn't need to actually write UI to be able to make a useful extension. For instance, like a code formatter or something like PowerShell Script Analyzer. You shouldn't need a UI to be able to actually integrate that into the editor. So some of the add-on models would be being able to get the currently selected text that the user has in their buffer and be able to change it or to insert new text somewhere, or just like buffer manipulation. That's something that's been missing from the add-on APIs. So that's a really big area. I think that's an important one. I know that Tobias Weltner is definitely interested in getting that stuff for ISC steroids, and really that's sort of a priority to make it easier for an add-on to interact in that way. One way that I kind of see this working is someone made a really nice script formatting module. I can't remember the name of it at the moment, but apparently it does a lot of stuff. What would be great is if they could just use their existing module code, register one simple function, maybe with a script block that does a little bit of wiring, and then they use their existing code, and it just is something that lights up a new feature in the ISE where they can just do their code formatting action, and that's it. They shouldn't need to write all this extra stuff just to be able to make their module be useful in the ISE. Another interesting thing would be is if they didn't actually have to get the user to explicitly wire up the extension in the ISE, like that it shouldn't have to put it in their profile. So if you ship your module that has this little extra bit of stuff for the ISE in it, you ship it to the PowerShell gallery and you put a special tag on it like editor command, then when you install that module, when the user installs that module on their machine, the ISE should be able to just like automatically load that up and just have it there ready. So there's all these little improvements we can make to make it easy for people to extend these tools with PowerShell and not have to do a lot of extra work. It's even more interesting when you consider that these things being available in other editors like VS Code. I mean, to be able to write an extension that works in VS Code without having to write any TypeScript, that's pretty cool,
There's a couple different things that I thought of even while you were talking. Is it would be cool in the ISE if I had like a little graph to show me how much memory PowerShell is using. Like as I'm ramping up a bunch of different threads or whatever, something that's consuming a lot of memory because I'm doing a lot of parallel operations. That would be cool to have, or something to improve the discoverability of the gallery. That's the big thing for me with the gallery is what's out there. How do you discover what's out there?
Yeah.
And how do you update stuff once you've got it? How do you know that the updates are available? Those types of things. I think there's a lot of opportunity around that too. That would, first of all, it would be helpful for people using the gallery, and second of all, would help more people be exposed to the gallery, so more people be using it and more people will be updating it, and it will become more and more useful as a tool.
Definitely. So the graph thing that you mentioned is interesting. So where would you like to see this graph if you were able to actually add it to the UI?
Down in like the bottom edge, like down where...
like the status bar?
Yeah, in the status bar in the bottom.
Like writing text or things to the status bar.
So one of the things that Tobias Weltner asked me for was the ability to have like a supported way to add new controls in the status bar. So that's certainly something that we could make happen, because if you could just put an arbitrary WPF control there, you could do anything. I mean, you could show a chart, you could show some UI that has buttons or like a status indicator or whatever you want.
Yeah, that would be very cool. That's exciting.
Yeah, there's a lot we can do, man. I mean, I'm really excited about the possibilities for what we can enable. I mean, it's going to be important not for me not to like go too far and try to do too much stuff, but I think that as a community, we can sort of like try to hone in on what things are really important, and for people to go to like the user voice site and ask for specific stuff like this, that would be really helpful. One thing that I'm going to do really soon is to create a GitHub repository for ISE add-on examples.
Okay.
And I'm going to use this as sort of the launch point for designing the new API shapes, so that when I make these new API changes, I'm going to have examples in this repo so that people can go and look at them, and also like file issues to say, okay, I don't like the way this works, maybe do it this way, or stuff like that, so that have a really easy way for people to be able to sort of see the changes over time and to be able to contribute their ideas.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Agreed. So I guess we just have the one more question, right, Jonathan?
Well, we should probably hone in on user voice a little bit, because that's not something we've talked about on the podcast, and that's a change. So can you tell us about the PowerShell team and moving stuff over to user voice and how to give feedback back to the team?
Yep. So Windows Server as a whole decided to move to user voice instead of Connect. I'm not sure like what the circumstances were for this change, but I think that many other teams in the company, like Visual Studio and others, had started using user voice and had some success with it. So we started moving there as well. So we migrated over a lot of the existing feedback from Connect to user voice, and now we're asking people to go to user voice to submit whatever feedback they have for feature improvements for any of the parts of PowerShell, whether it's the ISE or DSC or the PowerShell engine, pretty much everything. So there's a lot of feedback there already. So if you have an idea, go and check and see if anybody else has actually posted that idea and voted up, because the way that we prioritize what things we work on is by seeing how many votes they have. Joey Aiello and I went through some of the PowerShell ISE feedback, I think last week sometime, and we sort of changed the status on some of them, like as things we were planning to do or maybe need some more input on. So we're starting to actually go digest that feedback and start making some plans based on it. So it's really important for people to go and vote for the things that they find interesting. Just go check the site every now and then, see if there's anything new added, and just vote for the things you care about, because that's really the best way that we can try to prioritize our own work in the short term. Probably
the coolest thing I've seen so far was something with Visual Studio Code. Actually, when you added the PowerShell support, one of the first things I noticed is there's no code folding, and this huge module that I'm working on, it's not manageable if I can't fold stuff up. So I went and looked in user voice, and sure enough, somebody had already put that in there as a request. I voted it up, and I've gotten notifications since then saying, yes, it's on the roadmap. Yes, we're expecting it to be in the February release, which is really cool to be able to, know that something that I just voted on, I'm getting notifications, hey, this feature's coming, this is when you can expect it. To me, that's great.
Yeah, it works out pretty well. And the only unfortunate thing is that I've had such success with like GitHub issues at this point, and I think the VS Code team also has had such success with GitHub issues that it's almost like a point of friction to have user voice also. But I think the one thing the one thing that user voice does really well is the voting, because GitHub doesn't have any voting mechanism, and it gets really messy on GitHub issues if you have a lot of people saying thumbs up, yes, I want this. It's like just a page full of useless comments. So user voice, I think, is a great place for giving feature idea feedback. I think that GitHub is better for issue tracking, but user voice, if you want something new done in PowerShell, go to user voice and vote up those feedback.
Fantastic.
So I put some links in the chat room. We'll get those in the show notes as well. There's a blog post. It might have been, it was actually by Joey Aiello. On December 14th, and he talks about the change to user voice and the links to get there, so people will have access to that.
How are you guys actually typing in chat while this whole thing's going on? I haven't been able to watch it at all.
Years of practice.
Yeah,
years of practice. Yeah, don't worry about that. That's our problem to have to worry about. You have to split your brain into 3 pieces, basically, and you have to stream things as you go.
So is there any questions from the people in the chat room that they want to ask or anything?
We've actually pulled some of those into the chat while you weren't even noticing. So yes, there have been some questions, especially Rich in New York, and a couple others asked several questions.
Yeah, his latest one is, why is PowerShell always associated with Windows Server and desktops are treated like redheaded stepchild?
I can't answer that question. I have no idea.
Well, take a look at where Jeffrey Snover is and what his focus is. Data
there
center,
you go, guys.
Desired state configuration, doing large-scale management, and that's kind of a server thing. And I don't know, it was kind of surprising to me because I always kind of assumed that PowerShell DSC would become a part of SCCM, that you would be able to combine those two things. But that's, from what Jeffrey has told me, that's really not the case. That, OMS and Azure Automation are going to be more focused on the server side, and SCCM is going to be more of a desktop tool. And they've got their settings management, which allows you to do configuration against workstations and report on it, but, it's not the same as DSC. I don't know.
It's we might as well start talking about Office or some of the other large groups within Microsoft. Xbox. When are we going to get Xbox integration with PowerShell? Come on,
oh
Dave.
man, I'm going to do that. I'll do it tomorrow. Yeah.
There you go. So, David, I got one more question for you before we let you go. This is a question that we ask everybody who comes on the podcast.
Oh boy.
If you could be a superhero or have a superpower, what would it be and why?
I would like to be able to slow down time so that I can work at my normal speed, but get 100 times as much done, because I just don't have enough time in the day.
Nice.
That would be cool.
Very, very practical use of your.
I'm all about the practicality.
All right. Well, David, thanks a lot for spending time with us. This has been great to interact with you and give voice to a lot of questions from our listeners. So we appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. I'm happy to come back anytime. This is a great podcast, and I'm definitely happy that I got to come and join you.
Well, thank you for that.
Okay, that's it for tonight's interview.
That question
Very happy.
reminded me that we had a whole six or eight episodes of Heroes Reborn, and that's probably since the last time we had a show.
Yeah. And then it went on hiatus.
It came back. They did, I don't know how many episodes, and then they came back and they had the final 3.
Oh,
so
okay.
that arc is over now, and it sounds like they're not going to do another one, or it didn't get renewed. But
Really?
it was unclear if they were ever going to do more than one of those. But they definitely left it open so that they could. So I don't know.
Well, I'm sort of okay with that. I mean, TV has kind of changed a little bit over the past few years. It's kind of like everything doesn't have to be a whole season anymore.
Yeah.
If you want to do a story arc or, a mini series, you can just do those.
That's what the BBC did forever. I mean, they still do it, I guess.
Do they?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of shows on the BBC are 3 episodes for a season, and then they don't have another season for 2 years or something.
Huh.
Yeah, Black Mirror was like that. Not a lot of episodes.
There's another great show called Luther on the BBC. That's maybe 6 episodes a season. It's a really good show, but there's just not that much of it.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess the other side of that is, you don't get as much of that content that you want, there to be.
Well, then, Netflix is doing that too. If you look at things like Daredevil and what's that woman's name? The other one that they did.
Jessica Jones.
Yeah. Those types of things.
Daredevil started back up yet?
No,
Soon,
not yet.
Right? Soon.
I think so.
I feel like that was going to be soon. That's going to be good. I'm looking forward to that. The Punisher? Didn't they say that was going to be the antagonist?
I think
read that.
so. Yeah, I think I saw a blog post or something about that.
Oh boy.
Yeah, Sherlock was another example.
They're going to have a hard time beating the first season of Daredevil. That was amazing. It was so good.
I haven't seen it.
Oh, yeah, just binge watch it, man. That's a good show.
The characters, especially the villain, is so well done. I mean, it's just masterful.
Yeah, I heard a lot of really good things about that one, but I don't really watch many superhero things, and my wife's not a big fan of that, so we usually end up watching other stuff.
Like what?
Let's see, Person of Interest. Let's see, what else? I'm trying to think of what things we watched recently. I guess The Good Wife, which is a pretty like a drama type show. We're watching Leverage now, which is a pretty interesting, it's kind of spy type show.
I like the characters on Leverage quite a bit.
Yeah. It's definitely got more of an upbeat tone to it, even though they're sort of stealing things and causing problems for people.
Yeah, a little bit of Robin Hood kind of.
Yep.
But yeah, I like the characters in that show. All right, well, very good. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. This has been much fun getting back into the swing of things, Jonathan. We need to do more shows.
Indeed.
Yeah, guys. I mean, this is a great podcast, so you should definitely try to get it going.
All right, we'll try. Thanks to you, David. Thanks everybody in the chat room.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
We've had 2 Wilsons in a row.
Oh yeah, I guess we did. All right, see ya.
All right, good night.